everyone. Welcome to Module 4, Session 1 of ML Foundation. Our speaker today is Sanjam. So if you have any comments or any questions, please the chat or the Q&A box. With that said, I will hand it over to our speaker for this session. Sanjam?
Thanks, Franklin. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth module, the first session of the fourth module. If you're watching this live, thanks for joining. If you're watching this recording, welcome to the lecture. I'm going to be talking about deep learning, specifically hands-on deep learning. If you watched the previous course titled AI Foundations, we had given this a brief touch. So we had briefly covered some jargon, some topics. This will be much more hands-on. We'll be looking at a different spectrum of topics. And personally, this topic, deep learning, is the one that excites me the most in general in machine learning. So I'm really excited to be talking about this. So we're at module 4. If you're watching this out of sequence, you should be able to get a hang of things, but it's advisable that you should have watched the previous modules. There'll be 2 different sessions. This is the first one titled First Look at Neural Networks and an Introduction to H2O3. So to give you a brief overview, this lecture or this session is broken down into 5 different parts. The first one is a recap of deep learning from the previous course. So if you've watched it, great. This will be a quick recap. If you haven't, well, this should bring you up to speed with whatever we had covered in the previous session. Followed by which I'll talk about how to train a neural network. I really wanted to use a dragon in there, but I'd argue that neural networks are somewhat similar. Followed by which we'll dive into some more jargon, some more terms, some more details of how to do deep learning. And specifically, I'll do a hands-on session as well on showing you how to do deep learning using H2O3. Finally, I'll wrap up with a quick overview of different open source frameworks which you can use. There are quite a few number of them and the ecosystem keeps growing. And this should give you a good amount of knowledge to get started with deep learning or even go ahead and build a few neural networks of your own. So let's recap. Let's start by recapping what is deep learning. What does this word stand for? Where does it come in the world of machine learning? So deep learning is not exclusive to machine learning. If you look at the image, it's essentially a very small subset of machine learning. It's not exclusive to it. It's not outside of it. It's not outside of AI. There's quite a good amount of overlap between different things. So deep learning can be applied to NLP. It can be applied to computer vision and beyond. If you're curious about these applications, the next lecture will go into much more depth about this. This one is more foundational. This one is aimed more towards understanding the theory or understanding concepts that are being applied that allow us to utilize this in different sectors or different applications. So the word deep learning comes from deep neural networks. Now, what is even a neural network? That sounds awfully similar to what we have in our brains, right? So deep learning is actually it's an attempt to mimic human brains. In deep learning, we have a large number of neural networks, a large number of neurons. And these are artificial neural networks that are replication or a bad replica, if I may, of the human brain. It's an attempt by humans to replicate the human brain in a machine with an aim to create, if I may, a smarter system. You may also argue you could call it a general intelligence, but that's for the future. We're still far away from that. We'll be talking about what we call narrow AI in this lecture, though. So reminding you of some jargon, a perceptron is a single neuron. So a single neuron in an artificial neural network is called perceptron. This was coined by Rosenblatt back in the 50s. Deep learning is not a new concept. Deep neural networks work on a concept known as universal approximation theorem. You can look up that term if you want, or you can watch the previous lecture if you haven't for more details on that. So let's rewind by looking at an image of a ANN. Essentially, you have a different set of inputs going in, some math or some matrix multiplication happens inside of the neural network, some multiplication, addition, and you get an output. So that's a very simple overview of this. And if you collect and stack is the technical term, enough number of these, enough number of neural networks, you get a deep neural network. Hence the term deep learning. So how to train your dragon? Sorry, I mean how to train your neural network. I'd argue both are awfully similar. In a simplified world, let's say you have a set of inputs and you have a set of outputs. The function of your AI system or your model or your deep learning neural network, and I'll be using these terms interchangeably in this lecture, is to essentially be able to predict something, to be able to detect something. So this black box, or let's call it a model, has the task of being able to come up with an accurate enough output given a set of inputs. How does this get trained, or how does this learn what output to produce? So let's say we have a bunch of labeled inputs and we have a model that we have come up with. We've just completed this lecture and we've come up with a good intuition of a model that we'd like to use to come up with different outputs. And we'll look at different examples, but bear with the theoretical example for now. So in the forward pass, what we end up doing is we pass the input through the model and we get a certain set of predicted outputs. Now, these are somewhat different to what you'd expect. These are somewhat away or completely different from, not completely, but somewhat different from the expected output or the real world ground truth. So the difference between these is known as errors. And that's what we utilize to train or correct our deep learning model. So we pass the input to the model, get a set of outputs. We see how different are these. Quite literally, you could also compute the difference between expected values minus the output from the model, and you'll have a set of errors. Now, once you have these set of errors, what you'd like to do is you'd like to correct your model. You'd like to tune your model. Think of it as sitting against a control panel, being able to turn or rotate different knobs. And just the difference here is that those knobs could be millions of knobs and you wouldn't want to turn them manually. You'd essentially like to use an algorithm or an automated way to do that. So we'll dive into the algorithm that does that. But essentially what happens here is we iterate upon this, and using the errors, we tune the weights of the model. So depending on how high our error is, we might want to adjust the model in a different direction. We might want to rotate those control panel knobs into a different direction, which hopefully would give us a better output, reduce the error. And we'd repeat this process over and over and over and over again until we get to a certain level of error, which you could also call a certain level of accuracy. So let's say once you reach 10% error or 90% accuracy, you can subtract to get the accuracy. You'd call it a day, and you'd say you are pretty happy with your model and you have a trained model that you can use in the real world. Some more jargon reminders. The process when we pass the input to the model is known as the forward pass. And the process where we update the weights using the errors is known as backward pass. Let's look at an example and dive further into this. So let's say, and to remind you, this is a very simplified representation. Usually the neural networks we use in practice are much more complex, but let's say this is what our model looks like. So essentially we have a different set of input neurons, X1, X2, X3, and X4. We have a image of a doggy that we'd want to predict. And the task here for a model is quite a simple one, which is, does our image have a doggy or a cat? Now, once you have the input layers, you'd like to collect the pixel values. Remember, computers are simple or dumb machines, and you'd want them to work on numbers. You can't tell them, hey, this is what an image is. An image essentially in itself is also a set of numbers. So we take the image, which is a set of numbers, throw it into the input layer, and this gets passed on to what we call a hidden layer. Inside the hidden layer, different set of operations think of these as matrices. Essentially, these are matrices. You could think of this as a columnar matrix, and the hidden layer as further different levels of matrices. So different multiplication and addition happens inside. Again, this is a simplified representation, but that's what happens. And after passing the inputs through these, we get a certain prediction. Let's say we get in this situation, we get a certain level of probability that our image contains a dog with a 99% probability. So that's great. I think we've already trained our network. But in case the error is low, we understand that this is supposed to be a doggy, you're calling it a cat. So we'd want to train our network, and we'd iterate upon it until we get to good probability for all of our given images in our data set. So this process is repeated or is done for the complete data set that we have on hand. Now I'd like to dive more into the theory, introduce some more terms, and show you how you could train a network in H2C, which is an open source framework. The goal of this is not to introduce every jargon in the complete mathematical detail or every term in the complete mathematical detail. That is beyond the scope of this lecture. It will take quite some time, but this will give you a wide spectrum of overview and will allow you to further dive into different details depending on your interests. So let's revisit these questions. What is a neuron? What is a layer? A neuron is a single cell inside of a neural network. A collection of these forms a layer, and all of these layers stacked together form a neural network. And let's try to answer using this knowledge the question that how do we train neural networks? And let's look at a few tricks to making these work effectively. In the real world, it's quite challenging to make these work effectively, and you'd want to use a few tricks for that. So we'll look at those. So here we have the process of training our network. And essentially what happens is you have a set of inputs, which are numbers. You pass these into the network. Let's say this table or this matrix represents the weights inside of our model. So what happens is your input gets passed into this matrix. Let's assume that all of the matrices line up nicely and you multiply them together and you get an output. Now you pass this output through an activation function. This term is actually derived from the human brain, because in the human brain you have different neurons and these have activation depending on some electrical signals that get passed. So depending on whatever output comes out of this, you'd want to introduce a non-linearity, pardon the tongue twister, and you'd use this to come up with the predicted value. So the term to be noted here is predicted, and the ground truth will always be somewhat different. Now, using enough of these non-linearities, this time I got it right, you could essentially come up with a universal approximation theorem, and you could virtually predict anything. Not really in the real world though. Once you have this expected value, you'd want to find the loss. And how do you find the loss? It's the difference of predicted versus expected value. And training the model is just a process of adjusting the weights to reduce the error or the loss. Weight adjustment follows something known as a stochastic gradient descent. That's an algorithm that we use to adjust the weights. And we look at what is overfitting, how could you overfit your training data set, and how can you avoid that. Here's what's happening when you're training or adjusting the weights. So let's say this is the blue line represents all set of possible weights, and you'd like to minimize these against the error. How could you do that? Using some math, you could find the gradient by taking the differential. If you don't understand that, that's completely fine. But what you need to understand through this image is we initialize our model with certain set of weights. So the matrix we're looking at here, the zeros and ones, are randomly initialized, and we'd want to adjust these so that the multiplication of x with these becomes an optimum value for being able to predict if our input, let's say, has a dog or not. So we take the gradient and slowly move it towards the global minima, which means you'd like to reduce the error by adjusting the weights. And this is for the simplified representation, the meniscus of this parabola. Now, there is a fine distinction. This has been discussed in the series earlier as well, but just to remind you, you're using something known as the training data set. So using a subset of data to train your model. And model fitting or training a deep neural network is similar to curve fitting to an extent. This brings in some fine nuances, which are when you're training a model, you could have a balanced fit, which means you have a good enough fit. Good enough is very subjective, but the problem with this is you could end up overfitting your training data set. When that happens, your curve is particularly closely fit to just your training data set, and it doesn't work outside of it. So it doesn't generalize to the real world data set. Underfitting happens when you don't train your model properly, or you don't train it for long enough, and it doesn't fit at all to the training data set. And this translates to lower accuracies or predictions with less accurate labels. So most of the times your dog will end up to be a cat when you pass it through the neural network. I'll take a pause to take any questions from the live audience in case there are any. Otherwise, I'll switch over to the hands-on tutorial. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'll jump into the hands-on tutorial. If you're watching a recap of this, please feel free to leave these questions into the forums and we'd be happy to take them up. So now let's take the theory that we've just learned and apply it to a simple data set, a tabular data set, a structured data set. All you could use different terms. The goal of this tutorial is to give you an iterative understanding of a neural network. B, show you how you could actually be able to train this pretty fast using a simple API. What I'll be doing throughout this walkthrough is I'll be taking the same data set, showing you how to train a neural network using the H2O3 API, and slowly introducing more and more terms or nuances of training a neural network throughout this lecture. If you'd like to follow this tutorial, it's also updated on Aquarium or on the Learning Center. So you can log in to that, and this will be a walkthrough tutorial for you as well. It's a take-home assignment. Let me quickly hide the header and the toolbar to give me some more space. And I'm assuming this is visible to everyone in a nice format. So let's start by essentially all of these steps. Start by importing the necessary module. I don't speak R, unfortunately, but if you head over to the link that's embedded in the notebook, you should be able to find documentation for R language as well. This tutorial is focused in Python. So we'll start by importing, and in H2O3, we have a all different set of estimators. For this particular lecture, we're doing deep learning. So we'd like to import the H2 deep learning estimator and initialize an instance of H2. You could also follow this in Flow. I'm skipping that part of the tutorial. We'll be using the Python API. So essentially, in any data science or in any deep learning pipeline, the broad overview of these steps is you'd like to import the frameworks, prepare the data, followed by which you'd probably want to tune your model a bit, and finally train the estimator on different set of examples. Finally, you'd also want to see how these results are working out. Now the terms being shown on the screen are the ones that we'll be discussing. If you're familiar with these, great. You'll see we'll learn how to implement these. If you're new to them, we'll get a better hands-on understanding of all of these. So a single neuron is a building block of a neural network. We'll look at how to create a model inside of H2O3, add hidden layers, add different activation functions, how to train it, and how to interpret the losses. The dataset I'm using for this consists of, let me zoom out a bit so that I don't have to scroll horizontally. This particular dataset consists of different cars along with their economy, cylinders, displacement, power, weight, acceleration. The fascinating part to me was I was also going through these different cars as I was experimenting. I learned that the AMC Ambassador apparently had 8 different generations throughout the 60s and 70s. I couldn't tell the difference, but that's interesting. As you train different models, you also get introduced to nuances of the data set. So I know much more about these cars than I did before, just by training this model and looking at different things on the internet. So that's a interesting sideline for you to track. So here's the overview of the dataset. It contains different set of values. You could use this for your own example. You could also use a different one. What we'll be doing here is we'll be predicting the number of cylinders based on other predictors or other parameters. I'd like to point out a caveat here, or one mistake that I would make many number of times, even to this date, which is when you're passing a value to be predicted, you wouldn't want to include that in the training data set, which is why we have excluded cylinders in this list. If you end up doing that, you're causing a data leakage, and you'd be really happy at first with the accuracies, which I was, but essentially your model isn't learning anything. It already knows the answers. So it's like showing the answers to someone and asking the questions to them. You don't want to do that. Please be careful that you don't pass the labels to the neural network, or you'll cause something known as data leakage. You could read up more about that. So we pass on, or we set the predictors or X values, depending on what literature you read, these could be different. We set our Y variable, the variable we'd like to predict, which in this case is the cylinders. So using this data, which is important, which tells us what's the displacement of the car, how much power does it have, weight, acceleration, and year. We'd like to predict the number of cylinders, and we're leaving out the names here for the purpose of this exercise. For your own experiment, you could try switching cylinders to power or different values, or you could use a different data set altogether. You'll find something interesting just to that experiment as well. Or in my opinion, you'll learn how to build a neural network through that as well. So once we have all the data prepared through these 3 steps, we've prepared the data set. And remember, we had loaded the data set into cars using H2O import file. For this particular example, I haven't downloaded the data set. I've just imported it through the S3 link. So you could also totally do that. So what I'm doing here is creating an instance of, or an estimator titled cars DL using H2O deep learning estimator. And for now, I'm setting the activation to none. The reason being, by default, an activation layer is set using H2O3, and I don't want to do that. I introduce them in a second. Now, finally, coming to the interesting bit, you'd like to train this model. And for that, we'd be passing on the X values, the Y values, and the data set. Once we do that, we can look at the error value. So we're looking at mean squared error. Here, MSE stands for mean squared error. I'm not going to describe it again. You can look this up. The short summary of this is the lower, the better. So 0.13 is not 13% accuracy. It's 0.13 mean squared error value. Pretty simple, right? Now we have a neural network that has 0.13 mean squared error. Great, isn't it? How can we improve this, or how can we tweak around different details? So let's see what adding a simple activation layer to this neuron can do. And we'd also like to set up a validation data set. This has been discussed earlier, but you'd want to use this particular data set for validating your accuracies. So what we're doing here is we're splitting the frame in a 80% and 20% ratio. So 80% of our data goes to training, 20% goes to validation, and we're setting a seed so that we get the results so we get replicable results, and the split isn't random every time. To remind you, what we're trying to achieve here is we're trying to add an activation layer. And the focus of this complete walkthrough isn't to get the most accurate car cylinder predictor. It's rather to help you understand what are the different gears inside of a neural network, hyperparameters that you can tune, and how does that affect the model. So what I'm doing here is I've added an activation layer titled TANH. If you're not familiar with it, you can look it up. There are different set of activations that can be added and are utilized in the model. Here's a quick overview of all of them. The most commonly used one is ReLU, rectified linear unit. Researchers like to use different or somewhat complicated names, but essentially it just makes sure that anything greater than 0 gets passed through, and anything before that or anything that is negative doesn't get passed on to the next layer. So that's one of the most commonly used activation layer. There are different ones as well. You could pass different activation functions, and you could look at all of these. The most common one is ReLU. The homework I'd suggest experimenting with different set of activation functions here and seeing how that affects your model. Another thing we're setting here is epochs. So what is epochs? When you're training a model, you'd want to pass the data through it and adjust the layers, adjust the weights of the layers a few number of times. Because in the first go, you wouldn't have the best model or the best set of weights for the given task. We'd like to do, let's say, 15 passes of these. So essentially 15 iterations of looking at the errors, adjusting your weights, training it again, adjusting the weights again, passing it again through the neural network, getting the outputs, looking at the errors, adjusting the weights again. You get the idea. It's done 15 times here. And we're using an activation function, TANH, for this particular example. And that actually hurts the accuracy in this example. Why did that happen? We've added an activation, so your model could actually be better. It might actually be generalizing better. So as an experiment, you could try using different activation functions here or different values of epochs and see if the error goes down. So to remind you, the lower the MSE, the better. Or you could also try this on a different data set, see what accuracies do you get on that. Now, if you remember, a neural network has a large number of hidden layers. Large could be very subjective. In today's world, if you look up different models that have been produced by academia this year, those can be very deep neural networks. Very deep is also very subjective depending on the context. But for this particular toy example, I'm introducing a hidden layer of size 200 by 200. And since we've introduced some more layers, we'd like to train a bunch more. So we've set the epochs to 20. Again, to remind you, this outline is supposed to give you a better overview of both neural networks and H2O3 so that you can utilize this and get a better intuitive understanding. If you'd like to understand the mathematical intuition, you're welcome to ask those questions, but we won't be getting into much more depth of it. Which brings me to another concept known as dropout. Now, if you remember the small conversation about overfitting and underfitting, there are different tricks to reducing overfitting. One of them is dropout. And what this essentially does is randomly deletes these connections. So a neural network consists of all of these connections, as we had seen earlier. With some random probability, you delete a few of these connections And this actually helps reduce overfitting. If you're curious why, well, assuming one particular cell or one particular circle here is being overfit to a particular example, deleting it could remove that aspect of overfitting. So that's the intuition behind it. A funny example that was mentioned in, I believe, an online course was, think of this as being a drunk neural network where you essentially lose some memory, so you're not overfitting while you're using dropout. So we use hidden dropout ratios of 0.5, 0.5. So with 50% probability, we're deleting some connections. And for the sake of consistency, we set the C2 again the same value as earlier. Now, when we do that, and again, we're deleting 50% of the connections randomly here. So the accuracy gets hurt a bit because, again, we should be training for longer. As an experiment, you could try increasing the epoch, see how does that affect the model. So far, we've looked at epochs, hidden network, hidden layers, dropout, and setting a validation data set. Let's keep digging. What is a mini batch? This term comes up a lot for different data set, and generally as well, this term is used quite widely. Now, when you're training a model or when you're training a deep learning model, you'd be working with big data, which will be covered in the next lecture. But to give you an overview, you cannot load a data set worth a terabyte, let's say, just throwing a value out there, into your computer's memory and train a model. So you can't load it completely at once, which is what we were assuming thus far. Instead, what you'd end up doing is creating batches, creating different chunks of it. So let's say I have, what's a reasonable amount, of 32 GB RAM. And if I'm, let's again, assuming if I'm loading them into the memory, I'd break these data set down into different 32 GB subsets and pass it on into the memory, because that's the only way we could possibly fit that. So that's mini batch size. It essentially tells you how many examples do you want to, or how many rows, how many images, how many sentences. The context depends on the problem you're working with. How many of these would you like to include in a batch size? There's plenty of literature out there. You could, in general, use a size that fits best in your memory. Keep adjusting this until you run out of memory or until you can't fit it in your server or computer's memory. Again, with each step of these introductions or concepts, we're adding to the same neural network over and over again, and we're seeing how does it affect the accuracy or the behavior to build some intuition. This, in theory, shouldn't affect anything at all. If we scroll up to the previous values, they are somewhat similar, 0.192. And we're somewhat in the vicinity. There has to be some slight variance because that's how neural networks work. But essentially, we'll just look at how to batch up our data set into different portions in case we can't fit it in memory, which is true most of the times in the real world. Let's look at another concept titled learning rate. The name gives it away, but when you're training a model or when you're adjusting those weights, you have another knob that you can tune, which tells you how fast would you want the model to learn. How quickly would you want stochastic gradient descent to be adjusted? How quickly would you want the weights to be updated? The best answer to this, how quickly would you want or how high of a learning rate would you want, comes from experience and some general practices. You can see an experiment for yourself as a homework. You could try setting a very low learning rate. Quite intuitively, what this would do is, and to remind you, with every epoch or iteration, the weights get adjusted. The learning rate controls how fast are these being adjusted. So if you set a very low learning rate, your model will get trained very, very, very slowly, and you'll get to the accuracies that you want, but you'll have to wait a bit. Let's see. A high learning rate might not be best because your model would not be able to reach the mathematical minima, which is what we're looking for if you think of the parabolic image that we had looked at. So it might overshoot past that. And if you set a very high learning rate, your model potentially may never train. So these are very subjective numbers. In the real world, a good learning rate would be 0.01. So I usually try to start with 0.01 or 0.001. If you feel the model is training very slowly, you could tune it up a notch. You could use 0.1. If you feel it's overfitting, you could reduce it. How do you come up with this intuition? You have to train a lot of models. You have to look at the validation and test accuracies, the training versus validation accuracies, and eventually you'll start to get a hang of things. So what we've done here is we've introduced a learning rate 0.21 for the same set of epochs, and everything else remains the same. Turns out this is somewhat slower to the default learning rate or not as effective. Now, as we keep adding these parameters while calling cars underscore deep learning, remember we didn't have these earlier, which means that in H2O3, the API is figuring out by itself, or it has some default values that it sets instead of these. As we change them, the behavior will change. And in this case, it's worse than the default. Coming back to the conversation about overfitting, there's another way of reducing overfitting. And for any case in general, you'd want to reduce overfitting as much as you can. The way to reduce this is you can add another way to reduce correction is adding regularization. There are two sets of regularization that we'll just quickly glance over, which is L1. But both of these come with different issues, or L2. Both can add stability and generalization, but L1 regularization may cause your weights or the matrices inside your neural networks to remind you to become 0. Or L2 might cause these to become small. Now I'm skipping the math intuition behind these or the details. You can look at them, but that's beyond the scope of this lecture. Again, these are to give you another thing to keep in mind that can help improve your accuracies. And this is as simple as adding L1 value. Now this is a reasonable amount of regularization that we've added, and it actually helps our model, because if you see, we've cut down the error from 0.21 to 0.16. The lower the better. Or you could add L2 as well. So here I've added the exact same value for L2. And wow, it actually also helps our model, keeping everything else the same. So those are two techniques that you can also use for reducing overfitting. You can play around with these. You can also look at the details. If you're curious, you're welcome to ask questions on the forums. Now I'll quickly cover some advanced topics or advanced tricks that are utilized. If you don't know these, that's completely fine. You can skip this part as well, but this is used quite extensively. Now, the important part when training any neural network is you have weights in different layers. How do you create these weights? These weights can be empty matrices that contain all 0 values. You could have different set of values inside of these. So how do you create the first set of weights? Or how do you initialize them would be the right word. So here's one way to initialize them. Essentially what I've done here is I've created a first neural network and copied its weights over. So I'm using these weights as the benchmark for the next, or as the initializing weights for the next model. If you want to use different set of weights, and there are again quite different variations of how you can initialize these weights. You can read up more on that. You can pass that value over to different set of weights and biases. So W1 represents weight 1, B1 represents the bias respective to that. Once we have these, and we're stealing from our older network because I was too lazy to define new weights here, we're passing these over to a newer network with the parameter initial weights and initial biases. So now what we're doing here is we're using these weights, or you could use your own weights that you would have defined. These can just be numbers. Let's say 0, 0, depending on the dimensions, you could have different values. This could be a particular weight. This could be another weight. So you could have all of these values in W1, W2, W3, B1, B2, B3. And if for some intuition you'd want to experiment, or if you'd want to check if those work nicely, you could just pass them on while creating an instance of an estimator and see how that performs. So for this experiment, we can also look at the initial weights and biases. So here's what they look like inside of the memory. Remember, everything in a computer is numbers. Here we have a different set of floating numbers. And as we train the model, these would change. You can again interpret these values as well. We'll not be discussing those details. Another aspect that you could use, like I mentioned, there are different ways of initializing weights. So how you create those weights for the first pass also has a lot of variations. You could pick these from a uniform distribution. You can look up what is a uniform distribution, but essentially what we're telling our neural network here is please use a uniform distribution and sample weights from here to initialize our estimator. And for once, I decided to switch over to AUC so that I can show you, oh wow, this is a pretty accurate model. But well, how do we judge this accuracy? Do we have any benchmark? Turns out we do. One of these ways is cross-validation. So cross-validation is a process to understanding how accurately your model is performing. Think of this as batching your data set into different subsets and testing it against one particular subset that you leave out. These can be defined by the number of folds, and you can also decide how are these folds assigned. And again, these can be simply passed over to your estimator as different parameters. You could also set an adaptive learning rate. Why would you want to do that? And what is an adaptive learning rate? As your model gets trained, or as you reach lower into the parabola of losses, you wouldn't want to jump past it. So as your accuracies become higher, you might want to reduce your learning rate, or as your error keeps going up, you might want to increase it. So adaptive rate essentially tells H2 deep learning estimator, hey estimator, please make sure that the learning rate gets adapted depending on the values. And we said that by passing adaptive rate equals true. Another question that has come up during the weekly AMA sessions is, if you're not able to train models for long enough, or if your model is taking too long to train and you want to keep the experiment saved, you can create checkpoints. And you can save the weights or save the numbers, the matrices that you have trained through hours of compute on your CPU or GPU, and essentially create different checkpoints. This is a trick that I follow almost all of the time. If your training takes more than, to me, a reasonable amount is more than 6 hours, I'd always create checkpoints. The good part about that is if I end up making the accuracy is worse, I can always go back and use the checkpoint. Or if I have a good model, I can always go back and look at, hey, what was exactly going on there? So that covers the brief overview of details inside of a neural network and how can you utilize these as an extended task or challenge. And this is loaded again into the learning center for you all to try. you can try and utilizing the same API on MNIST dataset. This is a dataset that consists of handwritten digits and all of the values or all of the details that we've learned about the neural network. You can try adjusting these and seeing how that affects the accuracies and what does that leave you. How can you come up with a more accurate model? I've initialized these with some different values. You can adjust them and see if you can improve the accuracy with which this is working, or how does that affect your model. So that covers the hands-on part. And now briefly, I'd like to come back to my presentation and mention one quick fact. Open source frameworks for deep learning. It's quite impossible for me to cover all of them here. So what I'm doing here is just briefly in one slide itself, mentioning the name of all of these frameworks possible, at least the ones that I've come across. In no particular order, these are PyTorch, TensorFlow, DL4j, MXNet, Swift for TensorFlow. If you've come across some of these, well, great. The most commonly asked question by anyone is, which framework should you be using? We just had an extensive session on H2O3. Should you try PyTorch? Should you try TensorFlow? You get different answers across the internet. And what I want to point out here is it doesn't matter. So remember, these are tools for training a deep neural network. In reality, you'd want to use the one that you like the most. You'd be the one that would be coding these solutions for your company or for your experiment. And you'd want to use the one that works really well. So as an extended homework, I would request you to go through the examples, let's say, of PyTorch versus TensorFlow. These are the two most famous frameworks. And compare them side by side for any model that you like or for any task that you like. Most of the times, the code will be pretty similar or somewhat different. And these APIs, these frameworks, these Pythonic APIs keep evolving. So what is important, and to remind you, the reason we're trying to learn all of these concepts in this lecture is to be able to use these and apply it to any framework at all, if required. And once you have a good enough understanding, which I hope you would have some of through this lecture, you can go ahead and try TensorFlow. If you don't like it, or if your company requires you to use PyTorch, you could use PyTorch. The important thing here is to be familiar with the details and being able to apply them, having an intuitive understanding. And from there, you can essentially use any framework at all. Just head over to the documentations. Most of these have really great documentations. In a week or two, you should be able to use this, apply it to whatever task you're working on. That being said, these will be covered in the lecture that's coming up. Which brings me to summarizing and giving you a teaser of what's coming up. So we've covered the basics in some more depth today for deep learning. We've trained a neural network using H2O3. And very, very briefly, we looked at a few open source frameworks. So the upcoming session is also on deep learning, but this is being taught by really one of the best in the world. So this is being taught by Yahuin Babakin, Kaggle Grandmaster in competitions tier. At this time, he's ranked in world's top 100 data scientists in the competitions tier. Yahuin will be walking you through how to train a deep neural network in PyTorch, and further how you can also apply these in driverless AI, or how can you use driverless AI to apply these concepts to different dimensions. To remind you, there's also a weekly study call that happens every Saturday and Sunday. A few of the learners are kind enough to come hang out in those calls, and we interact a lot, ask a lot of interesting questions. So you're welcome to join any of these. All questions are welcome in these. And the next module title, Machine Learning for Big Data, starts next week. If you're watching a recap of these, and if you still have any questions, you can post them on the forums. This module, this particular lecture, has a walkthrough tutorial that you're required to complete, as well as a quiz that you're required to complete. These will be made available in 1 or 2 days after this live lecture is posted. And we require you to complete these for a badge requirement if you'd like to earn a badge. You can also head over to our blog for learning about deep learning, or you can dive into the H2O3 deep learning estimator documentation, which is very extensive for all details. That pretty much covers up all of the concepts that I wanted to cover in this lecture. Thank you for tuning in live or watching the recap. We have, I believe, 5 minutes for any questions that you might have. I see a question by Terence. Terence is also one of the most active learners, so thanks for that question. The question is, PyTorch and TensorFlow are frameworks. H2 Estimator is a framework as well. No, well, you're close. H2.3 is the framework, and H2 Estimator is the API we use inside of this framework to create deep neural networks. Again, as you go through this journey of learning deep learning, you'll start to realize that almost all of these are very similar, and you can take the concepts that you've learned to any framework of your choice. I think we have time for 2 more questions if there are any. Is there a way to see the defaults from the first run? Yes, you could head over to the documentations. So I'm assuming you're asking for the defaults of H2.3. You could check out the documentations, or if you simply type help and pass on the function inside of a Jupyter notebook or a Python session, it should show you the defaults and details. And these aren't random values. These are actually, these have been decided through experiments and are somewhat the standard. But again, as you build this intuition, and I would highly recommend training a lot of models to build this intuition of what values really work well. That's essentially how you'll get a better hang of these, or how you'll find out which values work really nicely. All right, thanks everyone for joining. I hope you like this lecture, and I hope you'll tune in to the next one, because that's really exciting, and that's being taught by one of the best Kaggle grandmasters from our team, who is also an extensive PyTorch user, and you'll get a taste of PyTorch and further different applications of deep learning through that. If you have any questions from this lecture, you can also join the weekend AMA sessions, and you're welcome to ask them.